was called Philip the Fair, but fairness had nothing to do with him. His face was carved like a statue, smooth and cold, but behind it hid a mind that ruled with numbers, fire and silence. He did not shout. He didn't even raise a sword. He simply stared, and kings fell, priests burned, and the laws of God bent before him. This was not a king who obeyed the heavens. He dared to strike at them. He defied the Pope. He stripped the church of its gold. And when the Knights Templar, the warriors of the Holy Land, stood too tall, he crushed them beneath a false trial and fed their bodies to the flames. His crown grew heavier, but his gaze never dropped. He was not mad nor cruel in the usual way, just precise, calculated, and utterly without mercy. But one day a man stood in the fire, unchained by fear, and looked straight at Philip with a voice unshaken by death. What he said was no threat, it was a prophecy, and like all prophecies made in blood, it began to grow. Some say the curse ended with that king, others believe it only started. That something passed down, not in words, but in blood, rotted quietly through generations, splintering minds, toppling crowns, and silencing voices one by one, until even history could not deny it. But before we reach those who inherited the ashes, this is the story of the man who lit the fire, the king who silenced God, and was, in the end, silenced by him. Let's begin. With a boy who learned to rule not by feeling, but by forgetting what feeling was. He was taught to rule long before he was taught to feel. That was the only lesson that mattered in a palace where love was a liability and bloodlines were built like traps. Philip wasn't shaped by war or hardship. He was shaped by the cold geometry of inheritance. His mother died when he was barely born. His father, Philip III, moved through grief like a shadow, and his older brother, meant to be king, died before the crown could weigh on his head. So the boy was lifted, not with affection, but with calculation. He was to become king, not by destiny, by elimination. No legends spoke of his boyhood. There were no tearful letters, no whispers of rebellion. He didn't charm the court, didn't inspire songs. He listened, he watched. He memorized what silence meant in a room full of men twice his age. Where other children played, he stood, perfect posture, hollow gaze. He learned that smiling made you weak, asking made you smaller, and kindness was something whispered in the dark, if it was whispered at all. By the time he wore his first royal cloak, he didn't feel like a child playing king. He felt like a machine built for the throne. France didn't know it yet, but it wasn't about to be ruled by a man. It was about to be ruled by a will, one that didn't blink, didn't beg, and didn't care what burned so long as it stayed standing. Even his beauty, something the poets clung to, was deceptive. He was called Le Bel not because he glowed, but because he froze. His features were flawless, yes, but lifeless, like marble, the kind used for tombs. And as the crown settled, France did not erupt in joy. It obeyed, quietly, as if the kingdom itself sensed that its new ruler did not need cheers, only control, but control has a cost. And to maintain it, Philip would have to stretch his hand beyond gold, beyond law, and eventually beyond God. That begins with the ledger, and the debt that would shape everything to come. The crown didn't feed him, the ledger did. Most kings dreamed of battlefields and banners. Philip dreamed of balance sheets. He didn't just want to rule France. He wanted to quantify it, every loaf of bread, every priest's robe, every coin that moved from peasant to pulpit. While others fought over land, Philip audited souls. He saw the kingdom not as a body to lead, but as a system to extract, and it bled beautifully. He taxed the clergy, defied old church exemptions, and sent clerks into monasteries with quills sharper than any sword. When bishops complained, he didn't argue, he summoned, and if they didn't come, they disappeared from records. The church was meant to be sacred. Philip turned it into an account. Even God, he believed, owed the crown something. He expelled the Jews, not because of piety, but because their loans could be seized and reissued under royal terms. He strangled foreign merchants with tariffs. He choked the nobility with forced gifts. Gold moved toward him like water toward gravity, and the more it flowed, the less anyone could breathe. But here's the twist. Philip didn't do this out of greed. He wasn't building palaces of gold or feasting beneath diamond chandeliers. He barely smiled, barely slept. He didn't chase pleasure, he chased order. A perfect kingdom, mathematically obedient, where rebellion had no room to breathe and faith had no room to interfere. France, under Philip, was not alive. It was calculated, and like any machine run too hot for too long, something began to burn inside it. The Pope watched. The nobles whispered. Even the peasants began to notice that the king didn't reign from a throne, he operated it like a levered device. No one could prove it yet, but France was becoming something unnatural, beautiful on the surface, unholy underneath. And soon, something holy would strike back, but it wouldn't come with trumpets. It would come with parchment, with steel-tipped riders, and with one name that would challenge Philip's system with fire: Boniface. No man can serve two masters, but Philip demanded to be both, King of France and Judge of Heaven. As his tax machine devoured gold from cathedrals and monasteries, one man stood in the way: Pope Boniface VIII. A man too proud to kneel, too loud to be ignored. He didn't whisper, he roared. And when he declared that all kings were subject to the Pope, Philip didn't flinch. He didn't rage, he simply wrote. Letters turned to summons. Summons turned to edicts. And soon, the French crown and the Holy See weren't just at odds, they were at war. Not with armies, but with decrees. Boniface excommunicated Philip. Philip declared the Pope a heretic. Europe watched, frozen. This wasn't just politics. This was God and king clashing over who got to own the soul of a nation. But Boniface underestimated who he was fighting. He expected a man. What he faced was something colder. Philip sent his men, mercenaries, masked in authority, to storm the Pope's own residence in Anagni. They broke down sacred doors. They beat old cardinals. And when they found Boniface, they slapped him across the face. It was not a war. It was a humiliation. For 1,000 years, no king had dared touch the vicar of Christ. Philip didn't just touch him, he shattered the illusion of divine protection. Boniface was dragged from his chamber like a prisoner, his white robes dirtied by his own blood and dust. He died shortly after, broken not by wounds but by disbelief. But here's the twist: Philip didn't just win, he reprogrammed what kings could be. From that moment on, France stopped seeing the Pope as untouchable and started seeing the king as something more than mortal, something almost invincible, almost, because one enemy had fallen, but another had been quietly growing, richer, older, and far more dangerous to Philip's perfect system. They had no throne, no crown, no voice in court. only swords, secrets, and a vault of gold earned in God's name, the Knights Templar. They bowed to no crown, obeyed no king, and carried the cross like a weapon. The Knights Templar were forged in the fire of crusades, sanctified by blood and papal blessing. But by the time Philip IV looked their way, they no longer resembled monks or martyrs. They had become something far more dangerous, a bank, a hidden empire with no borders, no elections, and no fear of royal decree. They lent money to monarchs, guarded secrets for popes, held keys to fortresses from Spain to Jerusalem, and their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, didn't kneel when summoned, he negotiated. To Philip, that was intolerable. He could crush a pope, he could tax a nation, but a military order, armed and untaxed, loyal only to their dead god and their living gold, that was treason disguised as holiness, and it had to end. But here's the twist. The Templars had done nothing wrong, not officially, no rebellion, no treachery, no threat declared. What Philip needed was not justice. He needed permission to destroy, and in a mind like his, truth was just an obstacle to efficiency. So he began to craft a story. Whispers turned into documents, allegations into edicts, sodomy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, night rituals by torchlight. He didn't need proof, he needed panic, and he knew how to light it. But Philip also knew something colder. If you want to kill an institution, you don't strike its borders, you strike its center. And the Templars' center wasn't a castle or chapel, it was trust. He would not just execute their bodies. He would dismember their image, and he would do it in a single, calculated night. Friday, the 13th, the day silence would scream. It didn't begin with swords. It began with envelopes, hundreds of them sealed with red wax, marked with royal command, and delivered across France under strict silence. Each letter bore a single instruction: wait. Do nothing until the 13th day of October, then open, then act. And when that day came, France exhaled, and the Templars began to die. Dawn had not yet broken when armored men surrounded Templar compounds, churches, and commanderies. Gates shattered, sleepers dragged from beds, priors chained beside novices. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was taken not in battle, but mid-prayer. They were not told their crimes, only that they had already been decided. Across the country, 15,000 men vanished into royal custody, and the moment they did, the accusations followed: heresy, sodomy, worship of false idols, crimes not designed to be proven, only to be feared. Philip didn't need evidence, he needed disgust, and the people gave it. Interrogations began before the ink dried, but they weren't really interrogations. They were performances in pain. Men were strung by their wrists until shoulders ripped loose. Feet scorched with oil and fire, teeth shattered, flesh torn, and when they finally screamed the words their torturers needed to hear, those screams became confessions. Philip now had what he wanted, the illusion of guilt. And with it, the legal grounds to confiscate the Templars' wealth, dissolve their order, and erase their name. But here's the twist: much of the treasure was gone, moved, hidden, or never existed as imagined. Philip didn't just kill the Templars. He killed a myth and was left holding smoke. And the worst part, he knew the gold was not the point. Control was, fear was. The erasure of an independent pillar of power, wrapped in divine robes, was what he truly needed. Because if a kingdom feared men who rode for God, then it would never fully bow to a king. So he burned the riders, and in doing so, set fire to something he could not see, but it would be a slow fire. The kind that waits for the final name on the execution list. They thought he would scream, he didn't. On the banks of the Seine, where the cold wind strung sharper than steel, Jacques de Molay was led in chains to a stake already soaked in oil. There was no trial that day, no prayer, no shield of God or man, only the king's silence and fire waiting for a voice. The crowds came not to watch justice, but to see a symbol fall. The last Grand Master of the Templars stood still as the executioners bound his wrists. He didn't beg, he didn't break. He looked straight ahead, not at the priests or the flames, but at the walls of the royal palace. And then he spoke. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. He named them: Pope Clement, King Philip. And in a voice untouched by pain, he summoned them both to stand before God's judgment within 1 year. No one laughed, not even the guards. The flames rose, flesh cracked. And as the smoke climbed into the Parisian sky, no cries came from the stake, only the sound of wood snapping under heat. By dusk, his body was ash, but his words weren't. What had been a public execution turned quietly into something else. A question, a seed, and for those who heard him, especially those in power, it became a weight they could not shake, because curses weren't real, but time was. And from that day forward, a calendar began counting down, not in ink, but in blood. Here's the twist: Philip won completely. He broke the Templars, seized their assets, buried their name. But he also created something he couldn't arrest or burn, a prophecy. And the moment Jacques de Molay named him, Philip stopped being untouchable, because what comes for a heretic may be the church, but what comes for a false king may be something far colder. The question now was simple: would the curse wait? It didn't. The fire died, but the countdown began. It didn't start with Philip. That would have been too obvious. It started with the Pope. Clement V, Philip's puppet, placed on the throne of St. Peter to sanction the destruction of the Templars, suddenly fell ill. Not a plague, not a wound, just decay. His body rotted from within, fever with no source, skin that blistered without touch, and then death, quiet, undramatic, but absolute. The calendar had begun. Next came Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's legal butcher, the man who orchestrated the charges against the Templars, the one who had stood behind every signature that justified their torture. He collapsed without warning. Some said stroke, others said poison, but the truth didn't matter. The timing did. Then the weight shifted. Philip IV, untouchable, unemotional, unstoppable, began to feel it, a tightness in the chest, a weariness behind the eyes. At first, he dismissed it. Kings don't fall from exhaustion, but something had changed, not in his body, in the air around him. His court grew uneasy, his nights grew longer, sleep fractured, and the fire that had always driven him began to flicker. Here's the twist. He didn't believe in curses, not really, but belief isn't the point. Curses don't need believers, they just need results, and the results were marching toward him, because what Jacques de Molay had summoned wasn't a spell, it was a schedule. One by one, the architects of the crime fell, not by sword or rebellion, but by timed collapse. The system Philip had designed, the machine of power, silence, and order, was eating its creators, like a clock counting backward, like a kingdom haunted by perfect vengeance. The king still ruled, still breathed, but in every corridor of the palace, in every chapel and every shadow, there lingered one question no advisor dared voice. When is it his turn? Well, he wouldn't have to wait long. It wasn't a battle, it wasn't even an illness, it was a vanishing. Philip IV, King of France, walked into the forest one morning in November of 1314. He rode for a hunt, as he often did, calm, composed, untouchable. The leaves had turned, the air was sharp. His entourage joked, unaware that the most powerful man in Christendom had only days left to live. Some say it began with a sudden numbness in the limbs. Others claim he fell from his horse, struck his head, and never truly woke again. But those were just details. The truth was simpler. He came back from the woods and never returned from whatever followed him out. Fever took him fast. His words slipped, his eyes dimmed, he stopped speaking. And then, without violence, without farewell, he stopped. No enemy blade, no rebellion, no final triumph, just silence. The twist isn't that Philip died, all kings die. The twist is how perfectly he kept the schedule. Jacques de Molay was burned in March. Philip died in November, 8 months. One prophecy, 3 bodies. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like accounting, something too precise to be legend. Too quiet to be coincidence. A line closed, a circle sealed. France did not mourn loudly. The crown passed. The records moved on, but something in the marrow of the kingdom had shifted. Because Philip IV didn't just vanish from life, he vanished from control. The man who built a kingdom of order, who ruled with math and fear, ended not with blood, but with correction. As if the universe itself had simply balanced the ledger, but the true cost hadn't even begun to show, because death was not the end of Philip's reach. His legacy, the sons he left behind, would carry his crown, but not for long. And none of them would outrun what he'd lit in the fire. What if the curse didn't stop at the king, but followed his blood? Philip IV had 3 sons. Each was crowned king, and each was dead within 14 years without leaving behind a son of his own. Not one, 3 branches, all snapped. Louis X came first. Young, strong, eager to rule, but barely a year into his reign, he collapsed after a game of tennis. Some blamed heatstroke, others whispered poison. Whatever the truth, his wife was accused of adultery, imprisoned, and his posthumous child, a baby boy, died within months. The line ended before it could speak. Then came Philip V. Cold and cunning like his father, he tried to restore order, but his only son died in infancy. His daughters were barred from succession, and after just 6 years, Philip V, King of France, was dead, quietly, without war. Without legacy. Last came Charles IV. He ruled as if walking over broken glass, every step careful, every alliance brittle. His wife bore only daughters. His second wife died giving birth. His third was pregnant when he died. The child, a girl, no sons, no heirs, no future. Here's the twist. France had never seen such precision in collapse. 3 kings, 3 failures, not by rebellion, not by battle, by absence, like something had unplugged their future. Not erased it, prevented it. And as the Capetian line, 300 years unbroken, crumbled in silence, the people began to speak of it differently. It was no longer politics, no longer bad luck, it was justice. The fire that took Jacques de Molay had left no ash, but it had left a pattern, and that pattern ended not just a man, not just a generation, it ended a bloodline, but something deeper remained. Because while Philip's sons died quietly, his system didn't. His method, his machinery of control, his cold blueprint of monarchy, and that, far more than his name, was the ghost that would keep ruling France. He died, but his system didn't. Philip IV left no son to carry his crown, but he left something far more enduring, a model of monarchy built on fear, control, and the erasure of anything sacred. It was subtle, efficient, and inhuman. He had burned warriors of God, chained bishops, bought popes, and buried legends, not because he hated them, but because they stood between him and total silence. And that silence outlived him. Under Philip, France ceased to be ruled by men with swords and became ruled by offices, laws, taxation, bureaucracy, cold instruments of obedience. The divine right of kings remained in name, but its soul had been amputated. What replaced it was governance by calculation, not conviction. Kings after him sat on thrones he had rewired, palaces he had sterilized. And here's the twist: his genius wasn't in what he destroyed, it was in what he normalized. Burning a man alive without proof, acceptable. Taxing the church, practical. Imprisoning entire orders with forged testimony, necessary. Philip didn't just commit these acts, he taught France how to live with them, and that's the horror. Because long after his bloodline died, his legacy shaped the hands that would later drag nobles to the guillotine. His cold, godless blueprint was still breathing when other kings would scream before crowds and lose their heads to metal kissed by revolution. He didn't live to see it. He didn't have to. Philip IV's true legacy wasn't in any crown. It was in the idea that a king could destroy holiness and call it reform. That sometimes the deepest rot doesn't come from chaos. It comes from order. Philip IV didn't just rule, he rewrote what ruling meant. And when he died, France kept following his script, blindly, quietly, fatally. The Knights Templar were gone, the Pope he humiliated dead, his 3 sons buried. His dynasty extinguished, but the machine he built kept turning, cold, efficient, without soul. And what started as a crown of marble became a coffin made of laws, but something lingered. Because centuries later, the bloodline he corrupted would speak again. In a king who mistook his own body for glass, shattered by whispers only he could hear. Watch Charles VI, the mad king of France, and see what happens when a kingdom inherits not madness, but a curse. And when the old system finally broke, it didn't collapse in silence. It ended with a blade, a crowd, and the head of a king lifted high in triumph. Watch Louis XVI, the last king of France who lost his head, to witness the final echo of a legacy that began in fire and ended in steel. More stories like this still live in the shadows of history. Subscribe, return, and step deeper into the dark with us. We'll be waiting, and history won't forget.